1890, my great-grandmother, Minnie Zuckerkandel, probably died giving birth to her son, my grandfather, Aaron Meyer Rosenfeld. That same year, the 21-year-old widowed husband, Kallel, short for Bezalel, left their home in Galicia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but now in Ukraine, and emigrated to the United States, leaving their son without a mother and without a father, the consequences of which have reverberated down through the following generations. Meyer, as my grandfather was commonly known, finally made the voyage to New York and rejoined his father in 1899, getting to know what would have been a stranger in a strange land for the first time at the age of 9. The following year, Kallel, now going by the name of Charles, married Annie Plattner.
They're alone to look after her sister, who had a child. And so they said, we got to arrange a marriage for her. He needed someone to look after your grandfather. She never let anybody know he wasn't her child.
The three of them moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where Kallel, now Charles Rosenfeld, was a produce merchant. Bernard and Annie had 3 sons between 1902 and 1906. Their daughter, Sarah Betty, who was to become the family matriarch, was then born in Montreal in 1906. The 1911 census places the family in Winnipeg, the Canadian city with the 3rd largest Jewish population after Toronto and Montreal, by which point our surnames had changed from Rosenfeld to Robinson, and by 1914, Bezalel had become Bernard, a founding member of the United Hebrew Charities.
Again, events in Russia precipitated an exodus. The pogroms in 1903, the pogroms in 1905, 1906. So by the First World War, 1914, the Jewish population had grown to about 13,700. The inducement that there were family members who could assist, who could support, and that made Winnipeg, curiously, a destination.
Family lore has it that Bernard owned 103 houses in Winnipeg. I have not found evidence of that many houses as yet, but I did find several court documents filed against him, including one that said he was nowhere to be found.
There was a depression, and he owned a lot of houses, and he got foreclosed, and he left.
A couple more rumored stops along the way, including upstate New York and Ohio, and the 1920 census places him as a junk dealer in Tacoma, Nebraska.
Some neighbors came and said they better leave one night, just get out, because they were going to run them out of town, because they were the only Jews there.
But by the end of the year after the Prohibition was enacted, he had set up Congregation Shari Torah in his own home in San Francisco. My father said Bernard had become a rabbi in order to bootleg wine, but apparently he was a rabbi before then.
I thought he had studied in Europe to be a rabbi. He came over as a rabbi.
5 years later, he was arrested for being in the possession of the equivalent of nearly 4,000 bottles of wine, but charges were dismissed. Whatever his flaws and faults, he did well by the children he had with his second wife, and they went on to lead established and stable lives.
He has 2 doctors, lawyers. Everybody did well. All 4 men and Lily, and my mother said her too. We know Lily, all went to university. No failure situation.
Except for my grandfather.
The chips were stacked against him from the get-go. When it starts with fleeing, your homeland, Like, you know, like things are already starting poorly.
In any case, when Bernard Robinson left Winnipeg to go south of the border, Aaron Meyer had already married my grandmother Mary Schmelnitsky in 1913. Their daughter Beatrice was born in 1914, followed by Arthur in 1916. My father Max was born a decade later in 1925.
You know, like for Grandma, you know, like the Cossacks are riding into town and setting things alight. It's time to leave Dodge.
Well, the big difference was that in the Russian Empire, Jews who were confined to the Pale of Settlement experienced both state oppression and poverty. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was, as you say, somewhat more liberal and acknowledged Jewish rights, they just experienced severe poverty.
Grandma was woken up in the middle of the night when she was about 11, and she was taken by family members and put on a boat with her cousins and her uncle to come over to North America. It was miserable. They were in the lower decks, but then Ellis Island was very hard for her.
And Israel Moshe, Israel Moshe, the father, and he was out of town working for him, and a pogrom occurred, and he was hidden by some Gentile, and after the pogrom was over, he came home and decided then and there they would leave and go to Winnipeg, where they already had a lot of the family.
And they asked the rabbi where they needed to go, and he said, Winnipeg. It's the land of milk and honey. It's Israel. She would have arrived in Winnipeg when she was 12 or 13 or something like that. And again, she wasn't happy. She was worked by her father. I guess she said he had some kind of store.
Young Jewish people went out to work at the age of 14 or 15. So they didn't finish high school.
As noted, Winnipeg had a large Jewish community, but Aaron Meyer took his family to live in a series of small rural villages with few, if any, Jewish inhabitants. The 1916 census puts them in Marquette, Manitoba, 30 miles west of Winnipeg. But Meyer has also served court papers intended for his father in Shoal Lake, some 170 miles from Winnipeg. The 1921 census puts them in Prelate, Saskatchewan. He's a hardware merchant, and this may have been his hardware store. Then, in 1927, Aaron Meyer buys the Star Theatre in Coronation, Alberta, just as the silent movie era was ending. Family lore has it that he said that there was no future in sound movies, but it turns out that he renovated the theater and installed the sound system, a very expensive undertaking, in order to show talkies. And he provided the local population not only with movies, but boxing, entertainment, and more.
What it was like being Jewish in rural Alberta, or even in Calgary for that matter, because, you know, it wasn't Winnipeg. You didn't have this sort of community to be a part of.
I remember him telling me that, you know, like his father would walk with him on the Sabbath, and they were easy to spot because of the way they were dressed. They were obviously Jews, and the kids would pelt them with stones.
In 1933, he takes over the Royal Theatre in Calgary, but by the end of the year, it is under new management, and by 1939, the family is back in Winnipeg. But between those dates, there are records of him in Saskatoon, and he also wanted to buy another movie theater in Edmonton.
My father, somewhere in the 30s, almost went into business with him, went into a movie house, or opening a movie house in Edmonton. But then my father decided not to, I think because people told him not to get involved, that your grandfather was not a particularly honest person. My father saying that Mayer got very, very angry with him. He had a real temper.
My grandparents had 3 children, Beatrice born in 1914, Arthur in 1916, and my father in 1925. Beatrice won a piano prize in Salzburg in 1954, but then got tepid reviews in New York. And according to my grandmother Mary, she took it to heart and gave up playing. Her son Michael, however, says it might have something to do with her having cancer that made it difficult for her to play.
He was a storyteller, and he was larger than life, and he would dominate a room.
People would start to cheer when he walked in because they knew that he was going to tell stories, tell jokes.
If we were complaining that it was cold, he would say, when I grew up, the snow would come in through the cracks, and we didn't have indoor plumbing. And when we would go to the basin, the little pitcher and basin, the water was frozen.
The story my dad told about having a very, very fractious relationship with his father that finally culminated in a real, towering argument.
He was being beaten by his father, and I remember him telling me that his father beat him. Like he didn't go into details. He said it matter-of-factly that he left. He was like a hobo, and he rode the rails, and he got to Toronto, and he connected, I'm sure through Winnipeg and Toronto, the Jewish family network, and that's how he knew the people at Shopsy's, and that's how he knew the guys at Schwartz's in Montreal. These guys took care of him, and I met a lot of these guys, and they did know my dad, and they cared very deeply for my dad.
I didn't really know what Passover was about. I didn't know what Judaism was about. I knew that I called my grandmother Grandma, and that the Cherniaks called their grandfather Zeta, and I didn't know what that meant.
I always took that to mean that the man had walked away from Judaism, like he was just done with it. It just had too much bad associations. My dad was 23 when he joined the army in 1939. He got out in 1946. Just how brutal it was, in the sense, forget about people trying to kill you and getting blown up. I mean, just the mud, the mosquitoes, the snow, the lack of food.
And then they went from there to the southern tip of Italy, and they sort of basically fought their way up northward, and apparently a town called Monte Cassini, they were blown up good enough to get into hospital in England.
He had the mental wounds, certainly, to prove it. He had some physical, he showed us, when I was a little kid, he'd say, yeah, bullet. So he had screaming nightmares all the time.
World War II, along with the Depression, those are 16 years that, defined their lives.
My father joined the Canadian Army during World War II, but the war ended as he was about to be shipped out. He managed to get to Israel in 1948 by being smuggled in a fishing boat, then joined the Palmach branch of the Israeli army, fought in the War of Independence, and was on a couple of kibbutz after that. I was born in Jerusalem, and my father subsequently returned with my mother, Miriam, and me to Canada to get his PhD in physics at the University of Toronto. Whereas I heard plenty of stories from my mother and my Aunt Hannah about growing up in Palestine and about the early days of Israel, my father said little about his past. Growing up mostly in Montreal, we didn't have much contact with our Toronto-based family. And in those years when we did live in Toronto, often my father wasn't on speaking terms with his siblings, Beatrice and Arthur. I know it's useless to do so, but I can't help but wish that I had started this project long ago when so many of the protagonists were still alive. I also can't help but think that had my great-grandmother Binny lived, it would have been a very different story. But as I would not have been born, I wouldn't be here to tell it.